It all began with a simple seat, a piece of stitched leather and polished metal in the front row of an aircraft. But by the end of the day, that seat would cost an entire airline its reputation. Marcus Richardson sat quietly in 2A, his boarding pass tucked neatly into his jacket, his platinum member card shining faintly under the cabin lights. He had done everything right, booked early, paid in full, arrived on time. And yet somehow, he found himself treated as if he didn't belong. A flight attendant approached with a tight, forced smile. "There seems to be a mistake, sir. We need you to move to accommodate our VIP passenger," she said, voice dripping with politeness that barely concealed the condescension. Behind her stood Karen Whitfield, a woman dressed in elegant designer clothes, her impatience practically vibrating through her manicured fingertips as they tapped against her diamond-studded watch. Karen's eyes darted between Marcus and the seat he occupied, as if merely seeing him there was a personal offense. "I always sit there," Karen muttered, her words sharp and loud enough for the surrounding passengers to catch. Marcus remained composed, reaching for his wallet and calmly producing his platinum member card. "I am a platinum member," he said. "Evenly, and this is my assigned seat." The flight attendant's smile tightened even further. A flicker of surprise passed through her features, an unexpected complication she wasn't prepared for, but was quickly replaced by a stubborn resolve. "I understand, sir," she said almost mechanically, "but this seat is typically reserved for a better customer." She gestured toward Karen without shame, making it clear that no matter what Marcus's status was on paper, he was not the kind of person they preferred in 2A. Phones began to appear, passengers whispering behind raised hands. They could sense it too. Something was wrong, something was about to break open. But what the crew didn't know was that in trying to remove Marcus from that seat, they weren't just mishandling an uncomfortable situation. They were pulling the pin from a grenade they couldn't see. In less than 5 minutes, their world would flip upside down. Marcus glanced at the boarding pass in his hand, then at Karen, who was now theatrically sighing and checking her watch as if she were the true victim here. Calmly, Marcus looked up and said, "I'll stay. This is my assigned seat." Jessica, the flight attendant, shifted uncomfortably. But before walking away, Karen made her move, stepping forward under the guise of stowing her bag and slipping a folded stack of bills into Jessica's pocket with well-practiced ease. "Thank you for helping with this," she whispered loud enough for a few nearby passengers to catch. In that moment, what began as a seating dispute became something far uglier, a transaction to displace a man because of who he was, not because of any mistake. What Jessica, Karen, and the rest of the crew didn't realize was that Marcus Richardson wasn't just any platinum member. He wasn't just a man in a nice seat. He was the founder and CEO of Right Tech Solutions, a $2.8 billion company specializing in customer service ethics and AI bias elimination, the very thing Skylux Airlines desperately needed to survive. And by trying to push him out of 2A, they had just handed the most powerful weapon to the very man who knew exactly how to use it. As Marcus stepped off the plane, the cool airport air hit him like a slap, but he stayed composed. No shouting, no visible anger, just swift, deliberate action. His fingers moved rapidly across his phone screen. Text to Elise, COO of Right Tech Solutions. "Assemble legal immediately. Emergency. Skylux Airlines discriminatory removal. I need the team online within 30 minutes. Marcus had been humiliated publicly, but he knew better than to react emotionally. His strength wasn't just in power, it was in precision. The storm he was about to unleash would be measured, unstoppable, and entirely deserved. Before he could even pocket his phone, a woman hurried toward him, clutching a carry-on bag and a cell phone. She looked nervous, her hands slightly shaking. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of witnessing something profoundly wrong. "Excuse me, sir," she said, voice firm despite the tremor. "I couldn't sit there and watch that happen. I recorded everything." She turned her phone toward him, and there it was. Crystal clear footage. Karen's smug bribery. Jessica. Accepting the cash. Trevor's condescension. Marcus's composed refusal. the forceful removal, every second, every injustice. Seared into digital memory, the evidence was undeniable. Marcus's expression softened for the first time since the incident. "Thank you," he said simply, and they exchanged information. She promised to send the full footage and to testify if needed. Marcus knew then, this wasn't going to be a quiet lawsuit behind closed doors. This was going to be seismic, miles away. In the sleek glass offices of Skylux Airlines, CEO Richard Williams leaned back in his ergonomic chair, staring at his phone. At first he had dismissed the call from PR as another overblown passenger complaint. But as he clicked the video link forwarded to him, color drained from his face. The footage wasn't grainy. It wasn't, he said, she said. It was devastating. In HD clarity. Trevor's arrogance, Jessica pocketing the bribe, the captain's hollow threats, and a black man, calm, professional, dignified, being dragged off a flight for refusing to surrender a seat he had rightfully paid for. Within minutes, Skylux Discrimination began trending globally. News networks picked it up. Celebrities retweeted it. The view count rocketed past 1 million, then 2, then 5. Marcus Richardson's name exploded across headlines. Williams dropped his phone, panic flooding him as reality clicked into place. Marcus wasn't just some businessman. He was the Marcus Richardson, the billionaire founder of RightTech Solutions, a company that specialized in detecting bias and building ethical customer service systems. The very man Skylux had been courting for a desperately needed $50 million modernization contract. And worse yet, RightTech, through strategic acquisitions, now quietly owned 25% of Skylux's shares. Marcus didn't just have moral leverage, he had legal control. Emergency lights flashed in Williams' brain. He summoned an emergency shareholder meeting within the hour. It wasn't damage control anymore. It was survival. When Marcus entered the Skylux boardroom, it was as if a gravitational force pulled every eye toward him. He was dressed sharply, in the same suit he had worn on the plane, a silent, pointed reminder of what had transpired. Williams, pale and sweating, tried to stammer an apology. "Mr. Richardson, I want to extend our deepest—" Marcus cut him off with a look. He didn't come for apologies. He came for accountability. Calmly, coolly, Marcus addressed the room. "As your largest shareholder," he said, voice even but lethal, "I am calling for the immediate termination of every employee involved, Jessica Miller, Trevor Bates, and Captain James Reynolds." His words hung like hammers. Second, the $50 million technology modernization contract with RightTech Solutions is canceled, effective immediately, unless full corrective actions are taken without negotiation. The board members looked at each other, horrified. Williams, desperate, tried to offer a compromise. "Perhaps suspensions pending investigation," he ventured weakly. Marcus leaned forward, resting his hands firmly on the table. His voice was low, cutting through the air like a blade. "Not negotiable. Accountability or Skylux collapses." At that exact moment, an assistant burst into the room with a tablet. She didn't bother with decorum. She shoved the screen toward Williams. "Sir, the stock. It's crashing. Down 12% and free falling. Analysts predict 30% loss by market close if we don't act." Silence crushed the boardroom. Trevor, Jessica, and Captain Reynolds were terminated before the hour was up. No appeals, no cover-ups. Security escorted them out through side exits, their names already irreversibly tied to one of the fastest corporate collapses triggered by discrimination in recent history. Justice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was in the small, devastating details. The closed laptops, the whispered exits, the realization on every executive's face that a man they thought they could humiliate without consequence now controlled their futures. Marcus didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. He simply watched, silent and composed, as the empire they thought was untouchable began to crack at the foundations, brought down not by shouting, but by calm, unstoppable truth. And it was only the beginning. Marcus Richardson could have ended it there. He could have walked away after firing those responsible, letting the world watch Skylux crumble under its own disgrace. But that wasn't why he built Right Tech Solutions. Marcus had never been about revenge. He was about transformation, the kind that leaves no place for old wounds to fester in the dark. Within hours of the shareholder meeting, a company-wide announcement went out. Effective immediately, all Skylux Airlines flights would be grounded for 48 hours. Every employee, from executives to baggage handlers, would report for mandatory intensive training on unconscious bias, ethical treatment, and customer dignity. No exceptions, no delays. The world watched, stunned. In an industry where every minute, grounded bled millions, a 2-day shutdown was unthinkable. But Marcus wasn't thinking about quarterly profits. He was thinking about integrity, the foundation Skylux had sold in whispers and contracts, but never truly believed in until now. Inside hastily converted conference rooms, Skylux employees filed into training sessions designed by Right Tech's behavioral scientists. This wasn't a check-the-box slideshow. This was immersion. Employees were forced into simulation exercises where their biases, both subtle and glaring, were exposed. They watched gut-wrenching reenactments of real customer experiences, saw how minor moments of judgment snowballed into life-altering injustices, and heard testimonials from people who looked like Marcus, who didn't have billions to shield. The many employees squirmed. Some wept openly. Others grew defensive, but the message was unavoidable. This was not about one bad day or one bad employee. This was about a system that had quietly rewarded discrimination under the guise of professionalism for far too long. Meanwhile, outside the walls of Skylux, the backlash intensified. Trevor Bates, once a confident cabin supervisor, found himself an internet pariah. Every job application he sent out was met with silence or rejection, his LinkedIn profile flooded with angry comments. Recruiters who once sought him out now ghosted him, unwilling to touch the brand of dishonor he'd built with his own arrogance. Jessica Miller fared no better. Her tearful apology, broadcasted live on social media, was met with little sympathy. She had accepted a bribe, and no amount of regret could erase what had been captured on 1,000 cell phones. Airlines closed their doors to her. Even ground crew positions, once a fallback, dried up. The mortgage she had relied on Karen's tips to pay now loomed like a grim shadow. Captain Reynolds, a man who had flown through hurricanes and war zones, faced a final descent he could not recover from. His 30-year flying career ended overnight. No major airline would hire a captain who had abandoned moral responsibility for the comfort of hierarchy. His pilot license still sat valid in his wallet, but no airline wanted his face representing their brand. Pride, once his compass, now pointed nowhere, and Karen Whitfield, elegant, entitled Karen, became the public's cautionary tale. Skylux issued a lifetime ban within days. Her social circles shriveled, friends distanced themselves, clients rescinded business. Her name, Airline Karen, was a trending mockery, her actions immortalized across the internet. Behind the designer handbags and polished smiles, Karen faced a mirror she could no longer recognize. Inside Skylux headquarters, the changes were tangible but painful. New policies sprang up like steel beams: zero tolerance for discrimination, mandatory transparency in customer service, protections for whistleblowers. Entire departments were restructured. Diversity and inclusion initiatives that had once been empty buzzwords became cornerstones, monitored by independent auditors, reviewed quarterly. But the scars remained. Employees whispered about the viral videos in hushed tones. Some welcomed the changes, grateful for a workplace that finally aligned with their conscience. Others grumbled quietly, mourning a culture where they once navigated comfortably without question. Marcus didn't expect perfection. He didn't even expect immediate acceptance. Change wasn't about flipping a switch. It was about exposing the rotten, daring people to rebuild something stronger in its place. At the center of it all, Marcus remained a quiet, watchful presence. He attended training sessions. He met with executives. He walked the airport halls and listened to the stories of ground staff, flight attendants, janitors, those who had been silenced for years by the subtle gravity of inequality. For Marcus, it wasn't enough to fix the symptoms. It was about addressing the disease. And while many would see his actions as retribution, Marcus knew the truth. Real justice isn't about revenge. It's about reconstruction. Still, not every story would find a perfect ending. Some employees left, unwilling to change. Some passengers boycotted, clinging to the belief that privilege should come with special treatment. And some corners of Skylux would take years to fully heal. But for the first time in its history, the company was moving in the right direction. Not because it had to, but because it chose to. And it all began with a man in seat 2A who refused to move not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told, subtly or brutally, that they didn't belong. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. For Marcus Richardson, real justice had never been about tearing down. It was about building something stronger in its place. He had seen too many systems crumble under righteous anger only to be rebuilt on the same broken foundations. If Skylux Airlines was going to change, it wasn't enough to punish. There needed to be a path to redemption for those willing to walk it. 6 months after the incident that shook Skylux and the airline industry to its core, Marcus launched something unprecedented, the Second Chance Program. A rigorous, unforgiving, deeply personal journey designed not to wipe away sins, but to face them head-on, break them down, and rebuild better from their ruins. The program wasn't open to everyone. It wasn't charity. It wasn't forgiveness, handed out like coupons. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown to those who had fallen, asking them, "Are you ready to earn your way back?" Among the first participants were 3 familiar faces: Trevor Bates, Jessica Miller, and Captain James Reynolds. Trevor arrived with visible reluctance, his jaw tight, his eyes wary. His arrogance had been stripped away in the months following the viral scandal, but bitterness still clung to him like a second skin. He spent the first weeks angry, at Marcus, at Skylux, at the internet that had branded him forever, but the program was relentless. Trevor was confronted with immersive simulations that replayed moments of unconscious bias, not from others, but from himself. Facilitators pushed him to dissect his upbringing, to pull apart the casual jokes, the quiet assumptions, the way he had been taught, without ever realizing it, that certain people didn't belong. For the first time, Trevor had to sit with the truth. He wasn't a good guy who made one mistake. He had been part of a system that measured worth by appearances, and he hadn't questioned it until it destroyed him. It was a brutal reckoning, but it was the beginning of something. Real Jessica's journey was different. She entered the program already burdened with guilt, her spirit battered by rejection after rejection, her once bright career in ashes at her feet. For her, the hardest lesson wasn't about overt prejudice. It was about silence, about how standing by and doing nothing was sometimes the greatest betrayal of all. In sessions that blurred the line between workshop and therapy, Jessica was forced to confront how fear had ruled her choices, how the small compromises she made to keep her job had cost someone else's dignity. "I thought I was protecting myself," she confessed during one session, her voice breaking, "but I was just making myself small enough to be part of the problem." Learning to speak up, learning to value integrity over convenience, that was the steepest climb Jessica would ever face. Captain Reynolds, older and more hardened by decades in the cockpit, struggled too. Not with malice, but with loyalty to the wrong things. For years, Reynolds had trusted the hierarchy above him, believing that loyalty to the company, to procedures, was the highest virtue. It wasn't until he watched the footage of himself, silent, complicit, towering over a seated man who had done nothing wrong, that he understood. His loyalty hadn't been to safety or service. It had been to comfort, to the idea that keeping the peace was more important than doing what was right. For Reynolds, facing that truth shattered something inside him that had seemed unbreakable. The road wasn't easy for any of them. The program demanded not just apologies, but action. Hours of community service, mentorship roles in bias training for new hires, public acknowledgement of the harm they had caused. They rebuilt slowly, humbly. Trevor took a job handling baggage at a regional airline. No titles, no prestige, just hard work. Jessica started over as a ground crew member, far from the first-class cabins she once glided through. Captain Reynolds found a new calling, teaching aviation students about ethics and leadership, warning them that the greatest dangers aren't always in the sky. They're in the choices you make on the ground. Meanwhile, Skylux Airlines itself was undergoing its own second chance. Months of visible, grueling reform had begun to turn public opinion. Customer satisfaction ratings climbed steadily. Passengers noticed the difference. Fairer treatment, transparent policies, a new kind of attentiveness that had been absent for years. The airline that once epitomized privilege and quiet discrimination was becoming an unlikely model for accountability. And change. Revenue rebounded. Stock prices recovered. But more importantly, trust, real, hard-earned trust, began to return. Marcus watched all of it unfold with a quiet sense of gravity. He hadn't fixed everything. He hadn't erased injustice from the world. But he had proven that real change was possible, not by issuing punishment alone, but by offering a path back to dignity through the fire of accountability. And for those willing to walk that path, like Trevor, Jessica, and Reynolds, the future, though uncertain, was no longer defined by their worst moments. It was defined by what they chose to do next. Because real justice isn't about who falls. It's about who rises after they've fallen, and how, and Skylux Airlines, battered but not broken, was rising too. 6 months had passed since the day Marcus Richardson had been forced from his rightful seat. 6 months since a simple act of injustice had ignited a reckoning that would ripple far beyond one flight, one company, or even one industry. Inside Skylux Airlines' glass-walled headquarters, Marcus sat once again across from CEO Richard Williams. But this meeting was different. There was no tension in the air, no desperation, no scrambling for damage control. Instead, there was quiet respect and a shared understanding that they had both crossed a brutal, necessary threshold. Williams slid a thick folder across the table. Inside were pages of audit reports, training, records, customer satisfaction surveys. Proof, not promises, that change had taken root. Marcus flipped through the documents slowly, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but carried the weight of everything they had fought through. "You've done more than issue apologies," Marcus said, closing the folder. "You've done the work." Williams exhaled. The tension he hadn't even realized he was holding finally releasing. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been cheap, but it had been worth it. Skylux wasn't just surviving now. It was thriving. Customer trust was higher than it had ever been. Employee satisfaction was soaring. The airline had gone from a cautionary tale to a new benchmark for ethical service. Marcus leaned back, studying the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "This," he said quietly, "is what real justice looks like." He turned back toward Williams, his expression thoughtful but resolute. "True justice isn't revenge. It's building something better, together." It wasn't about humiliation or destruction. It was about refusing to accept a broken system as inevitable. It was about forging a future where dignity wasn't negotiable, where every passenger, every customer, every person was seen, valued, and respected. And Marcus wasn't done. As he rose from his seat, gathering the folder under his arm, he glanced, back with a half-smile that hinted at bigger storms brewing. "This was just the beginning," he said. "Other industries still think they can operate in the dark. We'll see how long that lasts." Because Marcus Richardson had made a promise once, long ago at his father's grave, to make people see each other as human beings first. Now, he was keeping that promise. One company, one system, one revolution. At a time, the fight for dignity and justice was far from over, and the next battle, it was already on the horizon. Would you stand up against injustice, even when it's uncomfortable? Stay tuned for the next chapter of this journey toward a better world.